Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Leadership Lenses, a podcast designed for principals, heads of school, and anyone else aiming to lead, improve, and enhance Jewish education. We are thrilled to have with us today a leader and rising star in Jewish education writ large, Rabbanit Dr. Yosefa Wruble, who teaches Tanakh, Jewish thought, and Halacha in Matan here in Israel, as well as at the Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash, and is a lecturer in Herzog College's Tanakh department, where you may have heard me in the past note that I teach as well. Yosefa hosts the 5-year running Matan Parsha podcast, which explores the weekly Parsha and Haftorah through high-level text study, and also hosts the Migdal Oz podcast, Women Talking Mitzvot, which explores both halachic sources and women's lived experiences of keeping mitzvot. In addition to all of this, Yosefa is a Nishmat certified Yoetzet Halacha and a veteran Kala teacher, and she's currently writing a book on the intersection of sexual intimacy and religious life. So we are going to have some fascinating conversations today. Yosefa, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really happy to be here, and I always find it a little bit funny when the podcast table gets turned on me, so it's fun to be a guest sometimes as well.
Amazing. So instead of hosting today, you're guesting. And as I noted in your bio, and for anyone who doesn't know you, you're really involved in adult Jewish learning, in particular for women, but I think also broadly. Many of the people listening to this podcast deal with high school, elementary school, middle school education. So what we're doing as educators is trying to develop these students. And many of us use the phrase, we want to create lifelong learners. You know, whenever I do a strategic planning or other project with schools, we talk about who our graduate ought to be, right? Our portrait of the ideal graduate. And the idea of developing a lifelong learner is in almost all of those. And so it was fascinating for me to think about your perspective as someone who teaches adults, post-high school students in a variety of settings. And I'd love to start with the question of really asking you, so do you see lifelong learners? What builds somebody into being this phrase that we love to throw around of a lifelong learner of Torah and generally?
Okay, I think it's a really interesting question. And I first just want to start with like a sentence of humility, because think it could be really annoying when people who don't deal with the stresses of daily school framework come and say like, well, this is what people should do when kids are younger. And I really recognize that a lot of times it's simply about like how available and open a student is to even receiving the tools that are being offered, or, the wisdom that's being offered to them. And so often students get stuck in like a mind frame when they're in high school of like tests and getting on to the next stage. And then I could meet them, when they're in Migdal Oz, or when they're someone coming to study in Matan, or in one of the regular communal platforms that I teach on. And they're just like interested because it's a totally different setting. So I first just want to recognize that there's something sometimes like an unfair setup about that like, because I also teach students who are in university studying for a degree. And even there, I have to push them very hard for them to get to like that comfort zone of just learning for fun. Because once there's that framework and there's a test and there's a grade, it puts a certain kind of pressure. So I just want to say at the outset that I really am saying this all with humility, because I recognize that sometimes just a framework itself creates a different kind of environment, and that can be very hard to surpass. So I just wanted to put that piece out there first. I think
absolutely. And on behalf of everyone who's ever been, I started as a middle school teacher, like in particular, thank you. That is
totally.
appropriate
and I did teach a few
frame.
times in high schools and middle schools, and I did try that for a few different years, and it's just not the age bracket that I love. And I really believe you should love the age bracket you teach. So that's why I ended up shifting to much older. But that aside, that little caveat, I guess I would say two things. One is that there are some humans who are just more curious than others. Like there are some humans who just their skill set is really seeking to develop. And that's not necessarily something that we can inculcate in someone. We can take somebody with that propensity and like really augment it and enrich it. But we can even see on our own kids, if that's the house setting we're living in, that there are just some kids that are more curious than others, and my prayer, let's say I have one really right now, really, really curious kid, is just like, let's just not ruin it. I'm saying, like, let's keep that curiosity going. So there is an element here of temperament. But that being the case, if someone is sort of in the middle area, or they can go another direction, or they are highly, highly curious. I think that when it comes to lifelong learning, I really always think about these things as a muscle, and it's a muscle that has to be trained. And so if all a student is receiving is frontal teaching and they're only sort of a passive learner, they're just not going to have any good training in what it means to be a lifelong learner. Because a lifelong learner, I mean, you could obviously just, sign up for classes and that's great. And obviously there are many people who their weekly learning is to attend a class or a shiur or listen to something, through headphones. But I think that a really, really important tool is to like just give people autonomy in their own learning, and I think that we don't really have to look so far, meaning the model of a Beit Midrash is, to me, still the most salient model of what it means to become a lifelong learner. It doesn't solve the problem. Somebody still has to figure out how to carve out that time when they no longer are in a setting that makes it easily available. But we definitely can like start toning that muscle, right? By giving students in high school, boys and girls, of course, a Beit Midrash setting, of being able to come in, a setting where they choose, right? Where they choose what to learn, they could choose where to go. It's really good training for what they're going to have to do later when they're going to have to make choices and they're going to have to figure out, do I go to this exercise class or am I going to make time for my learning, right? Or like to figure out how to do that, to have them have charuta learning. I think that to me is a tool that's so obvious. And sometimes it gets relegated a little bit too extremely to like a later setting, or I'll say more than that. Sometimes in some schools, it still gets relegated to the boys only and not to the girls. Again, this is so variant depending on the school setting and what their hashkafa is like regarding these pieces.
Hmm.
So to me, I think that that's critical, is just being able to have a space where students are autonomous in their own learning. That's like a first go for me. What do you think about that?
So I love that, and it's interesting because in the past and on this podcast and elsewhere, we've talked about the idea of student-centered learning or active learning. And when we talk about it, we often talk about it from an educational philosophy perspective of how to build the best class, how to really, develop the best experience in that moment. But what you're saying is that actually is impactful forever. Right. And sometimes we sort of set up this false balance of, well, I need to get through a certain amount of material with them, right? I need to get through a certain amount of pages of Gemara or psukim or whatever it is. And therefore, I, as a teacher, need to teach frontally more because we've got to cover stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and often that's seen as more rigorous than letting kids learn on their own. And what you're throwing out there is, well, yeah, maybe you're covering more stuff, but if you want to talk rigor in terms of learning muscle development, then there is no substitute for kids actually doing that. And our job as educators is create the framework for them to be able to practice.
I mean, look, I think also I'm going to bring in the AI piece because I just feel like it's impactful in every single decision now when it comes to education. Um, and I think that ultimately, the idea that there's a person who's there giving over the knowledge. So we are going to be able to retain that more in a religious setting because I don't think that that's going to go out of fashion so quickly. Like, I still think that there's room for the person who has the knowledge. But I think that in general, that skill also, like of being able to learn, figure out what you're gaining from it, to be able to learn critically, right? Critically in the sense of to be able to gauge what's actually happening. Who are they in conversation with? What do I think about this? How does this interact with other things I know? Like those skills are like we don't have a way out of that anymore in the world we're living in. Like that is the skill that students need to learn. So again, I still think there's a tremendous amount of room for, a Rav and a Rabbanit, and for there being somebody who's there to give you a derech and a hashkafat olam, a perspective. But I think that like that is the currency now for the foreseeable future. I think it still was, by the way. I think it has been for a long time, but I think it will be almost like the most important currency moving forward. And so an autonomous setting like that, as long as schools are still holding on to ideas of how much they have to get through and they have to finish a certain amount of material in a year, I still think that there's an importance to maintaining a certain space during the week, a Beit Midrash program, et cetera, where there is that freedom that students can explore what they want, and that the role of the facilitator there, meaning it's to facilitate, it's not to teach necessarily, it's to be a facilitator of that event.
Right. Right. And I definitely hear that. And I'm very much on that same wavelength in terms of how we craft learning. What I hear is pushback. And I'm curious your perspective on this, particularly since you just mentioned AI, right? I can obviously go ask any AI I want, and we're getting better and better with like Torah specific AIs for information I need. But What does that mean for the literacy and body of knowledge that we need people to have in order to be literate? And do you even have to be literate to be a lifelong learner? So and yes, I'm putting the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, noting that, right,
Hmm.
encompasses a need to learn and a religious obligation to learn, but from a functional perspective for a moment. So, what do people need to know in order to be lifelong learners? Do they need to know anything?
Okay, so I think that there are a few elements that are sort of combined in that question. Meaning, I think that in theory, can a person who doesn't have a high learning skill set learn throughout their life? Sure, they can listen to podcasts and they can go to shiurim that are going to be on a level that speaks to them. They could do those things, and I don't think there's something wrong with that. Like, I don't think there's something wrong with that religiously. I don't think there's something wrong with that on a learning level, but I do think that it limits them very much. Like, I see students of mine who are coming in with a weaker background, and I'm talking more about the adults who are coming in later in life. And you're simply very limited in what you can do. Like, can you make it to that class, right? It's, again, it's also a personality thing. I'm a very autonomous kind of individual. So I like to be able to learn on my own and to think on my own. And I think that those are skills that take us through a lot of life and not just within learning Torah, like the ability to study a text and be able to understand how I'm interacting with it and what it is that it's telling me, and see this in a broader context. Like, those are skills that I think we need when we process any kind of information in the world. Like, I don't think it's Torah specific. So I think that those kind of critical learning skills, understanding my own motivation, what limits my motivation, and being able to have literacy skills. Like, is it ideal that people can learn text in their original form? Sure. Do we have so many tools today, translation tools, etc., that can help people? Yeah, like, I don't think that, I think that that's totally fine. And when people are, but I do also want to say that the human experience of learning with somebody becharuta, right, of interacting with humans, the more AI becomes powerful and popular, the more we see the need to like sort of put people in a gym where they practice being with other people. Meaning, it's a little bit like, we have to go to a gym to exercise because we stop moving on a regular basis because we sat down too much by our computers. So people are going to have to go to the gym of human connectivity. So I still think, again, like, we're so lucky that in the world of Torah, like, vintage, right? Vintage is our game. Like, that's a really good advantage. That's what the currency is. Let's be with people, let's connect with people, let's learn with people. And that's a great, obviously, antidote to a lot of what's happening. And we see just so obviously in the statistics surrounding AI usage in different school systems. So I think that those are all important. I still am going to say I'm old fashioned. Like, I think that everybody should be literate. Like, I'll tell you this also, Barry. I was thinking about this recently. When I allow myself to read fiction, I literally read like only one genre. It's embarrassing, but I read only one genre of fiction. I read
Okay, which
historical
one?
I read historical fiction that are untold stories of women. Okay, yeah, like, it's a bias of mine. It's what I have particular enjoyment about. And the theme that repeats itself constantly throughout, let's say the past 4 centuries of stories that I'll read about is, and earlier than that, is the idea of the lack of literacy, meaning that we worked for so many generations to make the world literate and also certainly to bring women up to par at a certain stage when there was a gap between their literacy and male literacy. Like, we've worked so hard to achieve that goal in the world with a belief that people should have access on their own to the world, to different texts, etc. And I think that there's something odd about the fact that, like, there are little elements in the world today that are kind of stealing away that literacy, whether it's hashkafic beliefs and what people should have access to or not have access to, or being overly dependent on an AI source to tell you what something says. Like, I think that, to me, like, part of being human is to be able to look at things ourselves and struggle with them and connect with them. And so, to me, like, it's kind of, again, it's going back into history and saying, hello, we still need this thing. So to me, yes, basic skills in reading and learning in Hebrew, in Aramaic, etc. Like, to me, because if we're going to use a computer for all of that, it's going to end up feeling like a crutch. And as humans, we know what it feels like to do something on our own versus using a crutch. And I still think that there are certain precious years of life where young people can devote their time to gaining those skills.
Absolutely. As you were mentioning that, I was thinking about the direction that many schools have gone in recently of drastically limiting any sort of phone access for kids in school. Either you checking your phone at the beginning of the day or whatever the school system is. And that was designed primarily to enable kids to flex their social muscles at school, to actually interact with each other rather than, sitting in the corner and scrolling. And in some ways, we're saying similar things about learning itself, right? That
Yeah.
learning, first of all, learning is a social activity, which I really love that frame. I think we don't think of that as much in high school because often we're trying to limit the way that kids socialize in class so that we can actually teach. But you're noting that learning, number one, is a social activity. It's something that to do well and to really enjoy, we need to do with somebody else. Oh, chavruta o mituta. It's got to be like that connection is there. And that kind of direct firsthand encounter with the text in a way that we learn how to be autonomous with it is an absolute necessity. AI and whatever comes next can always be an effective tool. And there's an element of AI literacy and tool literacy that we need to teach. But certainly in the world of religious education, and this may be true also in general education for the sake of learning and development, we need to enable kids to flex and develop those muscles. And actually maybe even becomes more important because they don't have to do it outside the classroom in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I would even take it a step further, Barry, because I think the Beit Midrash model is ultimately going to become the future model for all learning, meaning because of AI and because the breakdown of the teacher who has all the knowledge, which again isn't fully broken down, but it's breaking down, 6 months by 6 months. Like because that model is shifting, I think that the model of like, here's a lot of material. Let's see what you could do with it. Okay, let's see how you can frame it. Let's see you can find other frames for it. And let's put something together, right? And then we'll have some sort of summary class or, a facilitator who walks around the learning and really sits with people to make sure that they're on the mark and that they're understanding. To me, that's the model. Like that Beit Midrash model is ultimately going to be the full model when it comes to learning, certainly for high school students. I'm not saying this is not the same for elementary students who are learning, reading skills, etc. That I think is, many of those years are staying kind of intact with added tools. But high school in theory, even in Israel, we're having the same struggle, right? Should be broken down essentially. Like it is very independent. High
Mhm.
school learning here is independent, but it probably needs to be much more project based, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure again, every school system has tried to figure this out in different ways and has met with some successes and some failures. And the same is true in the high schools I see around me. But I think that that kind of like Beit Midrash setting is going to be our natural setting. And that might bode well for like future Torah learners. Do you know what I'm saying? Because it'll be a skill set that they're used to having. They're going to have to get really used to relying on their own, on their own skill set, on building their own perspectives and learning things and then seeing how they interact with them. So I think it bodes well for us.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And obviously there's, implementing that, like you said in the beginning, is we say this with a lot of humility, implementing that kind of autonomous, appropriate frame for individual and Chavruta learning in a high school setting is certainly challenging. But
Very
many schools have
challenging.
already moved in that development. And sorry, many schools have already moved in that direction and will continue moving in that direction. I want to
Yeah.
shift the question a little bit for a moment and say, okay, as a high school educator, I was always wondering, I'm preparing these kids and what's going to happen 10 years down the line? Like, what are they going to look back on from their high school experience and say, that was amazing? And what are they going to look back on their high school experience and perhaps in a way I didn't intend to realize, say that wasn't good. Like that's in some way getting in my way, or I was ill prepared, or in some way, this didn't help me get where I needed to go as a lifelong learner. So again, with the humility caveat in place, we know, but when you're teaching adults, where do you see the unintended positive or negative aspects of their high school education?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I think that there are so many answers to that. Like, I think first we need to just remember that high school students who just were really not focused or really absent, whether because of lacking skill set or difficult family situations, like some students just get through high school to get through it and then they kind of continue on their education after. So that has nothing to do with the teachers themselves. That has to do with students who kind of just are not available at that time. But I guess a few sort of phenomenon that I notice later on. One I'll say is I think that whenever there is something that's highly emphasized in a school setting, we normally need to ask ourselves, what's the flip side of this that isn't getting emphasized? And by the way, I ask that same question when it comes to the education I do in like a post high school setting. So let me just give a concrete example. There are a few schools out there, and I happen to see some of their graduates that are, like, phenomenal at giving skills to their students. Like, it's a really rare thing, but I have the privilege of seeing some of them, after high school, and they're really, really, really strong in their skill set, and they've had a tremendous amount of practice in learning. A lot of them will still complain that most of the learning was frontal, even when there's a serious amount of Gemara learning, it was still in a classroom and not in the Beit Midrash setting, which they themselves say was chaval, it was a bit of a loss. Those are like, like, what humanity are we developing in these students? I'm not saying that the staff didn't try, but I don't often sense that the students saw that that was important or as important as their cognitive capacities or getting into college. Like, who am I as a person, right? And how am I developing in my avodat Hashem, in being a good citizen? I'll just say, just to like balance the scales here, for example, Israeli high schools are really good at asking those questions and far less good at the cognitive pieces, like far less good at the intellectual development, but really, really good at saying, our goal is to make you a good citizen. If you happen to learn something along the way, that's great. But meaning, so like different schools are good at different things. So I'm not like, hitting this over with a hammer and saying this is terrible, but I'm just saying often the flip side gets a little bit neglected in favor of that kind of development. So that's something that I see often. That I'm speaking specifically about, like the 18 to 21-year-olds who are post high school, who kind of like just didn't ask themselves deeper questions about what their avodat Hashem should look like and where they fit into that, etc. Another one is in a school where they're, for a host of reasons, they can't or they aren't able to focus as much on skill set. So then you end up having a lot of times a very big gap between like your Jewish literacy skill sets and your other analytical skill sets in, I don't know, history or English composition. So that's another option, and there could be a million reasons why that happens, because in that school they're teaching an audience of students, a community of students who don't all come from observant backgrounds, and they're coming in with different skill sets, and they're all coming in from very different elementary schools, and so they have to spend a lot of time even the playing field. There are so many challenges. I'm not minimizing all the challenges. I'm just sort of noting what I could see later on. And another piece also could be just like a total lack of confidence in their knowledge and in their ability to study more. Like they just don't have, and it could be a result of that previous category, but just like a total lack of confidence in what they're able to do and coming in being like, wow, like know anything. Now, of course, some of that could be because they weren't paying attention. I recognize that. Other studies of theirs. And another one, which is just specific to Tanakh, because like I teach a lot of Tanakh, that's one of my main areas, is this happens a lot. I doubt it happens as much anymore, and I see it more in my adult students, but the sense of like that stories were simply skipped over because I thought it was going to be too complex, or they thought it was going to be inappropriate, or just books that are just are harder to teach, and so they don't get taught at all. That I see a lot of times, like, well, why wasn't I ever taught that? And I'll just say to that piece, and I'm not giving over an educational philosophy in two sentences, but I'll just say there that there are many schools that are in Israel that my children go to as well, where they have a philosophy of there's no skipping anything, meaning they just keep going forward. I really believe that there's always an appropriate way to present, things in the Torah, things in the Gemara can be very, very complicated passages. I think that there are some elements that maybe should be thought twice about teaching if they, have like sexual complex. But when it comes to Tanakh stories, there, by the way, I think Gemara more than Torah, because Gemara goes into very, very, very complex descriptions that can be really inappropriate, especially if they're teaching in a co-ed setting. True stories that I've heard from students of mine. But I think that when it comes to Torah, like there's really no way to like there are a million ways to present stories, and they could be presented at age appropriate levels. And I think that piece is also it's just being intellectually honest. I think is important.
Right, right. So I hear a few pieces emerging here, and it sounds like, on the one hand, there is that necessary balance between religious development and intellectual cognitive development. And so if we as educators are prioritizing one and giving that precedence over the other, we have to ask ourselves very carefully, right? Are we doing that right? And I know this is something that I've seen and recently was just talking to a few educators who are saying, look, I know I can develop a better relationship with the kids and help them with their religious development, but only if I don't push them as hard cognitively, intellectually, or if I don't
Yeah.
push them as hard skills wise, because they're much happier to sit in my classroom and hear me talk and be really entertaining and charismatic and all of that. We can have a great relationship and we can talk about their own religious development But if I make them break their teeth over a text and I'm pushing them on that, then I'm going to lose them on the religious development side. And what I'm hearing from you, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me, is you take some real risks and open yourself up to losses for the student if you veer too far in one direction or another. In other words, yes, it's really hard to do the religious development and the skills development at the same time. And if we drop one of those, we are doing a disservice to the students in their future learning.
I just want to say that I don't really teach American 18-year-olds. Like it's really, I see very few of them in a year, but I have observed from multiple settings that that shift has happened so strongly. Like students who just come in, they come for a year or two in Israel, and they really have no ability to study any Hebrew text. And I do think it's a big loss. Like I think it's a big loss because basically what it means is that we're relegating everyone's Jewish knowledge through the lens of translators who they themselves have ideologies. And I've seen that shift where like all the books on the shelf go to being like all these beautiful volumes of English translations of all these other works. I mean, not only do I also think it contributes to a break with Israeli society to a certain degree, but that's a different topic for a different time, which I don't think serves people if they're a Zionist institution. But I think that it really belittles it really belittles the capabilities of students. Of course, there are always going to be some students who that's simply not a goal for them. They're not able to do both. And for those students, okay, a good choice will be to go with the charisma and the connection to Torah. But for students who can move to that space and who can do both, I think it really does a disservice because they end up being really illiterate, not just in Torah. I've just seen so many examples of this where they just lose access to a lot of other pieces, and I think it's a loss. I think it's a long-term, lifelong loss.
Absolutely. And again, we're not saying here that we have all the solutions, right? I've been
No,
in that
definitely not.
position
Yeah.
of both teacher and principal of saying, how do I deal? Forget about what I'm giving these kids. How do I first just deal with them and get them to like be present in class? And so there's a lot of levels here. But what I'm taking from this conversation broadly, which I think is a really helpful and useful frame, is if we think about the way we're approaching our elementary, middle, and high school education from the lens of a lifelong learner, then we're thinking not only in terms of what do I need them to have in eighth grade or 11th grade, but what is the foundation that prepares them for the future? When you think about it from that perspective, you start to understand that you really do need all of these components. Balance, the tactics, and how we get there. Yeah, those are all questions. But if we're not dealing with the intellectual cognitive development, the religious development, and that hard skills development, then we're not giving the kids those three legs of the stool that they need in order to build on for the future.
Yeah, Barry, I think also the decision about like what to weigh more or less in high school. Ideally, it should be less complex because ideally a lot of that basic skill set should be acquired in a lower middle school age, meaning that's ideally, again, I recognize all of the challenges to that and the different backgrounds people are coming with. And I recognize the change in the classroom settings today with all of the, diagnosed and undiagnosed challenges that are there. But but I'm just saying that ideally that skill set should happen when kids are younger. I'm saying this also, this is the opposite of what your podcast is about, but I live in a world where I rely not so heavily on my school system. I also don't pay much for it. And therefore, my expectations, I live in Israel, my expectations are very, very low for what, my students should, my children should receive. And we do a lot of learning at home and we do a lot of skill building at home. Now, I get that not every parent is capable of that, but I want to say something bigger than that. Many parents are capable of it, but they're living in a world which tells them I'm outsourcing this skill to the school system. I'm paying a ton of money for the school system to provide that, and therefore it has to be done there. But I think it's also really important for parents to remember that this is also parents' job. It's not all on the teachers. Like, it's my job. My daughter just finished her first Masechet of Gemara, and we're going out to dinner this week as a whole family. She has Gemara in school. They learned a little bit, and I love the teacher. She's a good friend of mine, but I'm not relying on the school for that. Now, it's not because my husband and I don't work a lot. We work a lot, right? But meaning spend time with all of our children who are of this age and learn with them, because the literacy is really important. And I think that it's amazing. Whatever a school can accomplish is phenomenal. But I think that parents also have to take responsibility for this. This is not just the teacher system, it's also the parents who, if they think it's important, they have to take responsibility for it.
Absolutely. I most certainly agree with you. And any, educators listening, I'm sure are also saying, yeah, yeah, I really wish the parents understood that. And that's 100% true. I do want to just put a little bit of a note to what you said earlier that yes, kids should be getting all sorts of skills at elementary and middle schools rather than in high school. And most often as a principal, I had teachers coming into my office saying, well, they should have learned this earlier and they
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah.
And I said, that may be true. Now, I happen to be a principal of a pre-nursery through 12th grade, so we were always complaining about ourselves. But it was that next step of, okay, but now that they didn't, what do we do? So if they
Yeah.
come in and they have a wonderful skills, that's amazing and we can build off it. And if they don't, then we need to figure out how to incorporate all these and develop this lifelong learner piece. And I do want to come back and maybe we'll have to have you back to talk more about the role of the parent and what we can do as schools to facilitate and build that, because I think we are in a cycle of, yes, we want to provide tremendous value. We want to support, we want to educate. And sometimes we may inadvertently contribute to that message of, you can outsource all education to the schools. And we know that's not true. And it's not true on many levels. We as parents need to partner with schools, and we as educators need to send that message of partnership to parents. So those are all things that we'll come back to. But as we wrap up today, I just want to thank you. I know you're running in many directions, recording multiple podcasts, teaching in multiple institutions. And it was really a pleasure to have you with us today. If people listening want to learn more about you or have follow-up questions, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
I have a website. You could check out the website and contact me there. And they can definitely send you an email and forward it to me. I don't think I'm going to put my email address, my private email address on the internet right now, but they can
That's
definitely reach
wise.
out to you. Yeah, so we could definitely reach out to me that way. And I also just want to say one last piece, which is that I just wanted to be clear that everything I've said today is with like a major grain of salt, with like a true understanding how difficult the jobs of teachers are today, sometimes also because of really annoying parents. So the jobs of teachers are really, really, really difficult. And I think it is truly more difficult than it was, even 20 years ago. And I really wish that we are able to encourage our best and brightest to go into teaching and try and figure out how to keep shifting the system along with the way that our world of knowledge and learning are shifting. I think that there's so much to be done, and ultimately collaborative learning and autonomous learning with guidance is what's going to take our students certainly at a high school age and really help them soar later on. So I really just want to really take my mitpachet off to all those that are listening, and really just say thank you, because you're doing really, really, really important work. And ultimately, these conversations are just trying to tweak that and make it even better.
Amazing. Amazing. I agree 100%. The website that Yosefa mentioned is yosefafogelwruble.com. We'll put that in the show notes so you can see it there as well. And thank you. I think, for me, this has certainly reinforced certain areas and raised key questions. And I would encourage everyone listening to try and take this lens in whatever way works for you and apply it to your own work. What does it mean for us in elementary, middle, or high school when we think about the future of our students as lifelong learners? What questions does it raise? And what new approaches might encourage us to try out? Try some of that in your own context and let me know how it goes. I would love to hear from you, and you can always reach me at Barry Kislowitz on LinkedIn, KislowitzConsulting.com, our website, or Leadership Lenses on Substack. Have a wonderful day and happy leading.